Hello and many thanks for inviting me to the University of Sussex today for this webinar on exploring DORA. Somebody had to do that. Responsible metrics, research evaluation and you. My name is Lizzie Gadd. I am a research policy manager at Loughborough University and I chair the International Network of Research Management Societies Research Evaluation Group, the LIST Bibliometrics Forum and the Association of Research Managers and Administrators Research Evaluation Special Interest Group, quite a mouthful. And my talk today is going to be about the growth and limitations of responsible metric statements. So just so we're all on the same page, responsible metrics is what exactly? Well, I would say that responsible metrics is a movement that seeks to ensure that the use of metrics in the evaluation of research is done responsibly, mitigating against perverse effects and unintended consequences. So why is this important? Well, without putting too fine a point on it, metrics can kill people. So back in 2014, Professor Stefan Grimm from the Imperial College London died by suicide after he was told he was not meeting the expected income generation target of £200,000 per annum. And there is undoubtedly a growing audit culture in higher education, just as there is globally, which is having a negative impact on our academic colleagues who are already facing a higher mental health risk than other professions. And in case we're under any illusions as to the role publication metrics can play in all this, I think this tweet from Tanvir Hussain, an academic at Nottingham University, says it all. He says, back in the days when I was an ECR looking for a permanent job, a massive chunk of my mental health issues was down to SciVal. I was obsessively comparing publications with others. And if you're still not convinced, the recent Wellcome Trust report on research culture was very clear that the overarching experience of most researchers was one of a pressured, competitive environment underpinned by metrics. And clearly the way the community has chosen to address this issue is through the development of a series of responsible metric statements, declarations, manifestos, reports, principles. We have DORA that was set up in 2012 by a group of cell biologists in the US, which is essentially a backlash against the use of the journal impact factor to assess individual researchers or articles. We have the Leiden Manifesto, which came out in April 2015 from CWTS Leiden and Co., which is 10 principles for responsible use of bibliometrics across a range of evaluative settings. Then we had the Metric Tide report, which came out in July 2015, which was an independent review of the use of metrics in research assessment, and it came up with 5 principles for the use of all research metrics. And then more recently in 2019, we gained the Hong Kong principles for researcher assessment that are based around research integrity. So to signify a commitment to responsible metrics, organisations can either adopt one of these statements, come up with their own bespoke statement, or of course just do metrics responsibly and not develop a statement at all. However, that last option is becoming increasingly less likely due to the involvement of research funders, increasingly unhappy about the impact of journal metric addiction on the development of open access. So Coalition S, the group of largely European but increasingly global funders behind Plan S, have as their 10th principle commitment that funders will only assess research based on its merits, not its publication channel, its impact factor or its publisher. This is a commitment that the Wellcome Trust took one step further and pushed on to their grantees, who must now make a public commitment to the principles of DORA, even if they don't sign, and have a plan in place to implement those principles and to monitor their progress against those plans. So how is the community responding to these expectations? Well, the LIST Bibliometrics Forum that I chair have run annual surveys on responsible metrics for the last 6 years to try and plot progress with this agenda. And you can see that there is a steady upward trend in the proportion of institutions who responded to the survey developing statements, that's the red line, and signing DORA, that's the blue line. And of course the two aren't mutually exclusive, many organisations do both. And in terms of the influences behind all those bespoke statements of principle, you can see that the Leiden Manifesto is right up there, influencing almost 60% of bespoke approaches, followed by DORA with almost 50%. And of course, why reinvent the wheel? Borrowing from another university's principles was quite common too, with just under 20% doing that. And I think it's fair to say that because DORA came first and it offers individuals and organisations the opportunity to publicly declare allegiance, unlike any of the others, and it's not actually that demanding of institutions, only 2 of its 18 principles are targeted at universities, and they have staff dedicated to its promotion, including an excellent chair in Stephen Curry. It has gained the most traction. However, it's not been everyone's choice, and Loughborough is one of those who rather famously have not signed DORA for reasons I outlined in this blog post back in 2018, when it was rumoured that UKRI were going to make being a DORA signatory a prerequisite for grant funding. Now, I'm not going to go into all the detail here, but we opted for the Leiden Manifesto, mainly because it was less science focused and it went beyond the poor use of journal metrics to governing the use of all bibliometrics, and beyond a focus on researcher evaluation to all forms of evaluation, KPIs, school level monitoring, etc., which was important to us. But since our original commitment to a Leiden Manifesto-based bespoke set of principles around the responsible use of bibliometrics at Loughborough in 2016, after a policy review in 2019, we extended it to encompass all forms of research metrics and included an additional principle around the need for training in the policy. And as you can see, we have a link to a short training video on our policy webpage. So to summarise, an approach to responsible metrics is much needed, and responsible metrics statements have helped kickstart both conversation and action in this space in describing what they think good practice looks like. And of course, the entrance of funders making demands around responsible metrics has ensured that even the most laggardly institution is now seeking to do at least the bare minimum required to support the cause of open access. So why doesn't my talk end here? Well, despite the enormous good they have done, they do inevitably have their limitations. And the first limitation of responsible metric statements is that they are open to interpretation and misinterpretation. And it was very interesting to see the responses to the question, how has your policy affected your use of metrics in practice, in our 2019 Responsible Metrics Survey, where responses ranged from avoid all metrics, ban certain metrics, reduce use of metrics, use metrics in line with policy, use metrics alongside peer review, use metrics in context, develop new metrics, use a wider range of metrics. And assuming these are all outcomes of broadly similar responsible metrics policies, which of these is right? And of course, such policies are never loophole free despite their best efforts. And when they're seen as the letter of the law rather than something evoking the spirit of the law, things can come a bit unstuck. And we saw this quite recently when DORA signatory Liverpool University opted to use SciVal's field-weighted citation impact metric to inform redundancy decisions, even though the FWCI is only stable for publication sets of 10,000 outputs or more, something even the most prolific academic would struggle to achieve. And of course, the authors of the Leiden Manifesto and the Hong Kong Principles waded in to condemn this action as contravening the principles of ethical and responsible use of research metrics. The bitter truth is that depending on your reading of DORA, there is technically nothing to prevent the use of the FWCI for assessing researchers, because it only demands that institutions be clear about the criteria they're using for hiring, tenure and promotion decisions, not redundancy, and that they consider the value and impact of all outputs when undertaking research assessment, which I guess they could have argued they did as part of the selection exercise, but still decided to look at FWCI as well. I mean, it's a stretch, and the spirit of DORA is very much not not to use a single publication metric to assess researchers, especially one as unfit for purpose as FWCI. But Liverpool are signatory to DORA and clearly didn't see this activity as contravening that commitment. So I suppose the larger point is that it's difficult for a single statement to predict and mitigate against every instance of poor practice. For this reason, Loughborough has added an FAQ to our policy which clarifies for both evaluator and evaluatee some issues that, despite our best intentions, proved not to be as clear as we thought. The second issue with statements that focus on the responsible use of metrics is that metrics are not the only problematic evaluation tool in the toolbox. Peer review, whilst being held up as the gold standard of research evaluation, has recently been subject to a lot of scrutiny. We know there are huge issues with conscious and unconscious bias around gender, institution, academic fame and English language use. There are also challenges in getting the appropriate expertise to form a proper assessment and ensuring proper representation within the peer review college. There's a lot of concern about peer review and a lot we don't understand about peer review. Indeed, Professor Alan Dix, who was a member of the REF 2014 computing panel, did a fascinating post-REF correlation between peer review scores and citations in his unit of assessment and found significant gender and disciplinary biases amongst panel members. This led him to conclude that whilst metrics are rubbish, people are far worse. And whilst we might laud our metric tide report, we might also ask when the peer review tide report is coming out. Especially as we are possibly in danger of baking in our existing biases as we move to training AI tools to support the peer review process. And Alessandro Cecco and colleagues recently wrote an excellent piece on this, which surfaces some of the dangers. The third limitation of responsible metrics statements is that they do tend to make universities their focus and university assessments of researchers in particular. But universities are not the only guilty stakeholder in the world of responsible research evaluation, and researcher assessments are not the only problem we face. So I put together this simple graphic of what I call the research evaluation food chain, and you can see that yes, there are a lot of researchers, our autotrophs at the bottom there, on which the whole food chain depends, and yes, they are evaluated by universities. But universities only evaluate because they are evaluated by funders, by governments and by the world rankings. And the life source, of course, for this particular food chain is our metric suppliers and our data vendors, without whom the whole thing would collapse. And as UKRI Chief Executive Ottoline Laser said at a recent Responsible Research Assessment event, any evaluation further up the food chain will ultimately find its way into the working life of our researchers. Just think about the REF. And I would argue, although I can't prove, that the reason Liverpool were so keen to retain their highly cited researchers, especially those that score well in FWCI terms, is that citations form such a critical part of the main global university rankings. And indeed, it's a version of the FWCI that is used by the Times Higher World University Rankings for their citation score. Coincidence? And if I was ever asked to substantiate this argument, I would point to the fact that Liverpool were not the first university to use FWCI to identify candidates for redundancy. Manchester University did exactly the same thing a few years before. We measure because we're measured. And in my view, the global university rankings are our apex predator. Some of the work the INOMS Research Evaluation Group have been doing to rate the global university rankings was to highlight exactly this point, that ultimately responsible metrics doesn't start with researcher assessments by universities. It starts with university assessments by the global university rankings. Indeed, I recently wrote a blog post that argued that if we love DORA, we have to hate the rankings, because the journal impact factor and the global rankings suffer from exactly the same four problems. 1, they are poorly constructed. 2, they are invalid proxies for the things they're used to evaluate. 3, their use in decision making is therefore highly problematic, and 4, leading to extremely negative impacts on researchers and the global scholarly enterprise. And I think the time is coming where we as institutions may have to accept that a commitment to responsible metrics is not compatible with participating in and celebrating the global university rankings. And one of the reasons for this is the problematic data sources on which the rankings depend. So this data shows the proportion of journals indexed by Scopus from the global north, 81%, versus the global south, 18.4%. So if we're seeking to act responsibly and we care about equity, should we be using such sources at all? And of course, these inequitable sources underpin much of our institutional citation analysis, including feeding some of our citation tools. And these, of course, bring with them other problems. So here we have a screenshot of a well-known citation benchmarking tool that a former University of Sussex employee now works for, and you can see that they are clearly signifying that this collection of citation and publication indicators amounts to an individual's overall research performance, not their publication performance, their research performance, something every responsible metric statement would deny. And right there is the offending field-weighted citation impact indicator that even Elsevier staff publicly stated during the Liverpool case was not a suitable measure for individual researchers, but it sits there bold as brass on a researcher overview page headed Overall Research Performance. So can we blame Liverpool for getting this wrong? Or do vendors have a part to play here? And if they do we as proponents of responsible metrics have a part to play in lobbying our vendors for more responsible tools and services? The fourth complaint that you often hear about responsible metric statements is that they can be perceived as being very negative. Don't do this analysis, don't use that metric, don't forget to take discipline into account, don't use metrics as a replacement for expert assessment. And of course, never, ever, under any circumstances, mention the GIF, i.e. they tell us what we can't do, but they don't always really help us understand what we can or should do. This is why some of the other work the INOMS Research Evaluation Group have been doing is to develop a positive, practical framework which guides evaluators through how to actually run a responsible evaluation. This is called the SCOPE framework, and SCOPE is an acronym. And to give a brief overview, SCOPE starts, S, with what the evaluator actually values about the entity being evaluated. Now, that might sound obvious, but we find that too often evaluations go wrong because they don't start here. They either start with what others value, such as the ref or the rankings, or with the available data, and they work backwards, rather than doing the hard work of understanding what it is that we value and evaluating accordingly. Counting what we can measure rather than measuring what counts. It's called the streetlight effect, as illustrated by this cartoon. Where did you lose your wallet? In the park. So why are you looking here? Well, because this is where the streetlight is. And as we know, many evaluations rely on bibliometric data, not because the volume of publications or even their citedness is what they value, but because it's so readily available and so easy to use. The C of SCOPE stands for context, and too often we have conversations about which indicator is responsible and which indicator is not, without first articulating the reasons we're evaluating, the why, and the nature of the entity under assessment, the who, which of course can have a significant impact on our approach. And this matrix plots 6 key reasons for evaluating alongside various entities of different sizes and attempts to indicate what the associated risks are. So, for example, plotting the publication volume of one country against that of another for the sole purpose of understanding their relative production levels has very little impact on the countries under assessment, so we've labelled that green. However, any form of assessment at the level of the individual that results in reward or lack of reward, i.e. allocation activities, has a high impact on those individuals and therefore carries a greater degree of risk. And of course, the other key context consideration is discipline. So an indicator that works for entities in one discipline will not necessarily work for those in another, even if the evaluative purpose is the same. So if we come back to our old friend, the FWCI, this report uses that indicator to analyse the citedness of various countries over time, which is fine because they are large entities which have tens of thousands of documents, and its purpose is to understand their relative citedness. It's only when we come to use it for identifying individual researchers for redundancy that it becomes problematic. So considering context is really important. Once we've thought through what we value about the research activity we're measuring and the context, we suggest an important pause before launching into our options to consider whether we actually need to evaluate at all. Now, this might sound like an odd thing to say, but we're increasingly using evaluation to incentivise certain behaviours, certainly in open access and open science, which may not always be mature enough to be measured. So this is a reminder that incentivising behaviours can be done in many ways. And if you're familiar with Brian Nosek's excellent research culture change pyramid from the Centre of Open Science, you may be convinced that we need to make things possible, easy and normative before we can start measuring and rewarding them, even if we do value them. Okay, the O of scope is for our options. And the focus here is to consider all our options for measuring what we value in this particular context and not just reaching for the numbers. And ultimately to check if our measure is a suitable proxy for what we're measuring. And a good rule of thumb here is that we should use quantitative measures for quantifiable things, citations, publications, money, students, and qualitative measures for qualifiable things, quality, diversity, excellence, value. And we should use extreme caution when using quantitative indicators as a proxy for qualitative things. So citations do not equal quality, ranking position does not equal excellence. P is for probe, and this is again a too often neglected stage of our evaluations. The probe stage asks 5 key questions. Firstly, who does this discriminate against? Secondly, how might this be gamed? Thirdly, what might the perverse incentives and consequences be? Short-termism, goal displacement, neglecting anything that's not measured, mental health challenges. And fourthly, do the benefits of evaluating actually outweigh the cost of evaluating? A very important and rarely asked question. And the final stage is to run the evaluation and to evaluate it. And if you're interested in seeing how this might work in practice, we are in the process of workshopping scope with a series of organisations, funders, universities, publishers, and have started producing case studies that others can learn from. And we've recently found out that UKRI are using the scope framework to support their reconsideration of the REF in the UK. And I've gone through the scope process in a bit of detail because I think it provides a practical way of making good on our responsible metrics policies. Indeed, at Loughborough, the scope framework now forms part of our responsible metrics policy training because it's such an easy, memorable way of ensuring that our evaluations follow through on our policy principles. My final limitation of responsible metrics statements is that whilst we like to use the expression responsible metrics, the truth is that metrics can't be responsible, only people can be responsible. And as we've seen with the Liverpool situation, an institution can have all the responsible metrics statements it likes. At the end of the day, it's only going to be as responsible as its people and particularly its senior leaders. And I can without hesitation say that the reason Loughborough was the first institution in the UK with a responsible metrics statement wasn't to do with any particular genius of my own, but due to our responsibly minded, person-centred Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research, Steve Rothberg. And the reason it continues to have such an impact on our activity at Loughborough is that he will regularly champion its cause and adjudicate cases where necessary to ensure that our practice and policy match. Unfortunately, our LIST bibliometric surveys have shown a bit of a worrying trend in the reduction of involvement by senior managers in developing such policies, which probably explains why 3 respondents to our survey made reference to the value of a policy to influence senior managers to encourage them to make more responsible decisions. Now, I'm sure this is not a problem at Sussex because we're here today, but because we know it has been a general issue, the iNorms Research Evaluation Group have developed a short one-page guide containing 5 arguments that you could use to try to persuade higher education leaders to evaluate responsibly. And I think it's probably quite a nice summary to end my talk with today. The guide is on the iNorms web pages, and obviously it will depend on your local setting as to which of the arguments you think might have traction, but essentially it outlines the moral argument for responsible research evaluation, that it is fairer and institutions that engage with poor practices put their staff well-being at risk and with it expose themselves to reputational risk. Secondly, the fact that responsible research evaluation simply leads to better decision making. Campbell's law tells us that we get what we measure, essentially, by measuring what matters and with indicators that actually indicate those things that matter to them. Institutions are simply more likely to make the best decisions that lead to the best outcomes. Thirdly, when you are potentially investing a lot of money in research staff, systems and activities, institutions would also be wise to ensure that they're investing wisely in meaningful evaluations that are actually going to give them valid answers to their questions and not waste money on shortcuts that won't. Fourthly, the increased focus on responsible research evaluation as a result of sector agendas, including open research, improving research culture, and responsible research and innovation. Obviously, we have Plan S, and the Global Research Council is also taking an interest in this area. They held an online event last November on this topic, so it seems likely that further funder expectations might follow. But finally, whilst there are external drivers like those, ultimately we argue that responsible research evaluation gives institutions an opportunity to maintain and exercise their institutional autonomy as mission and value-led organisations, enabling them to set and pursue their own goals and measure progress against their own goals and not the goals of others. So to conclude, the irresponsible use of metrics is a significant issue across the scholarly enterprise and a major driver of poor research culture. And responsible metric statements can certainly help in leveraging institutional change. However, we have to remember that they are limited in what they can achieve on their own. Universities can't fix this single-handedly. There are other stakeholders here doing all sorts of untold damage, and it's not just metrics that are the problem. But if your statement leads to more value-led research evaluation approaches delivered by people truly committed to responsible practice, both inside and beyond their institution, I believe that we will see significant change in research evaluation practice that will ultimately have a positive impact on our researchers, on their research, and ultimately on the communities that they serve. Thank you very much for listening. I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation with you.